By way of brief introduction, what we're going to be doing is talking about basically Agile portfolio management and some systems that we've used in practice to do this. The basic flow of this presentation, we're going to talk about what Agile portfolio management is and why we should consider some perhaps new ways to address it. I'm going to walk through some fairly specific ways to actually build a visual management system which can help to facilitate essentially the interactions that allow us to do Agile portfolio management. And finally, I'm going to go through some tips and tricks for actually facilitating these integration sessions themselves as we go forward, and finally end up with the time for us to answer whatever questions you might have to pose. So again, my name is Arlen Bankson. I'm a co-founder of a company called Lightspeed. We're based in Alexandria, Virginia, an Agile coaching and consulting company. We've been around now about 6 years, and I've been doing Agile in various flavors for about 12. Scrum and extreme programming, Kanban, and so on. What we're going to be talking about are actually some experiences that I and some of my coaches have actually applied at some specific companies, everything from very large companies to small ones. So getting started into the meat of it, let's talk a little bit about what Agile portfolio management is. What is a portfolio, first of all? Perhaps a trivial question, but we want to get our language correct here. A portfolio is a group of projects or releases that are related. So this is really a big picture sort of situation where we're trying to align against many different teams working possibly even with different methodologies. In fact, some of the examples that you'll see here today were in fact in environments where you had both Agile teams and waterfall teams working alongside and tightly integrated with one another. You may have teams that are across different areas, and they may even be in different companies using third-party vendors and the like to provide some critical aspects of the systems. We also mentioned programs, and this is, of course, very similar to a portfolio, but a program is actually a group of related projects, whereas a portfolio may be a bunch of things that are only loosely related. So this is really an enterprise-level situation. So what's the issue? Really, the issue is just that not many Agile methods do that great of a job of addressing these big picture sorts of situations. We have a lot of issues with integrating across multiple teams, and certainly the idea of Agile and waterfall teams working together is a shocking proposition to many people. But nevertheless, this is the world we live in, so we've got to find ways to deal with these sorts of situations. And perhaps one of the most critical things I'll call out here is a way to communicate upwards to senior stakeholders and offer them a forum to actually communicate their visions downward. This is a big gap in a lot of Agile implementations. Senior stakeholders don't really know what's going on, and our typical metrics like velocity and the like are really rather inadequate for really conveying the current situation. So if you were to ask yourself what it is exactly we're trying to accomplish with an Agile portfolio management system, there are a few things. One of them is we want to make sure that people trust that our Agile teams are doing what they're supposed to be doing so that they can continue to maintain the autonomy that we'd like them to have so that they can get better. And in order to do this, we have to be transparent, and transparent in a way that makes sense to these senior stakeholders who are engaging with us, and of course to other teams that we're dealing with. There's also there's a long-term aspect to this, in that these sorts of systems can actually be a big help in, over time, bridging the gaps that tend to exist between organizational silos. These being, not just development and testing and the typical IT side silos, but also some of the business side silos like marketing and sales and so on. We always want to be able to bring those more closely together, because at the end of the day, a large-scale Agile adoption will never work unless those groups involve themselves in some meaningful fashion. So those are some of the sorts of things that we'd like to accomplish here. And so you might ask, what about the Scrum of Scrums? This is kind of the de facto method for Scrum, one of the most popular Agile methods to facilitate coordination between multiple teams that are working in concert towards some similar goal. On paper, it sounds fine. It tends to follow a very similar format to the ubiquitous daily Scrum or daily stand-up, where teams talk about what they've been doing since they last met and what they're planning on doing soon, and any issues or dependencies that might exist between them. That's all well and good, but it does tend to lack a few things in practice. One of these is just specificity around how exactly it works. You'll see a number of different formats for the Scrum of Scrum, and they tend to be suitably vague, let's say. There's also the aspect that they tend to rely on the Scrum Masters a little bit more than perhaps they should. Scrum Masters tend to have obviously good insight into what's going on in their respective teams, but they may or may not have deep insight into the specifics of technical dependencies and things of that nature. And also they may not be able to actually make calls about what to do about dependencies. And furthermore, relying on them as the sole method to communicate upwards and outwards to senior stakeholders is often not really the best idea. We'd rather them get more engaged directly rather than relying on secondary reports about what's going on. Because, as we all know, agility really relies on rapid adaptation across the board. So people need to know what's going on, and if they need to make a decision, they need to have the proper information to make it right in front of them, and they need to be able to make it as quickly as possible. So for all these reasons, the Scrum of Scrums out of the box tends to not be fully suitable. And of course, one of the other gaps that we've identified, which is the core topic of this presentation, is that they often lack a clear visual management system, something that people can get around and tangibly interact with to see what's going on across all these teams. And as many of us are visual people, that's a major gap. So if you look at this in really the big picture, what we're talking about is trying to coordinate across many different teams. So you see here these concentric circles of strategic planning, cross-team, and team level. A lot of the typical Scrum and XP and Kanban sort of sessions, they tend to operate largely at the team level, right? They're talking about doing releases for a specific team, doing sprints, and so on. And they don't necessarily focus that much on how to tie it together and roll it up. So the systems that I'm going to be showing you are really focused on, in fact, that roll-up, that ability to see at a level that makes sense and is not too detailed, allow stakeholders and the people that are working the projects to understand what's going on, and highlights the decisions that need to be made at specific points in time. So to put it in a nutshell, the cadence that you'll typically see for these portfolio management sessions tends to align more or less with the sprint cadence of the respective teams that are involved. And if there are waterfall teams, what we're doing really are creating artificial cadences within which they can interact with the Scrum teams. So they would get together every 2 weeks, despite the fact that they might have multi-month phases that are going on, because we're trying to create a way to roll it all up. So let's begin to look at some of the elements that we might see in a system like this. What you see in front of you here are some examples of, in fact, specific tools that we've used. These are real examples, obviously, at various companies. One of them, a very large insurance company there that you see in the back. And you see some elements that are going on here. Those columns are time, and these rows are value streams. And I'll go into the details of all that in just a moment. But you have, basically, you can imagine a number of people standing in front of this board about every week or two, and what they're having are brief conversations on the order of, anywhere from 15 minutes to maybe an hour sum total to talk about the coordination points between all the various teams that are involved in this effort. That board you see there in the background was involving anywhere between 17 and 22 teams, a few of which were Agile, and the rest of which were actually waterfall. So it provided a way to really mitigate a fairly risky situation. And by the way, the thermostat there in the third sprint, they delivered that no problem. So that's in there. So let's take a look then at some of the aspects of this. First of all, this isn't a pattern that we created. This is, in fact, something that's just emerged. And a student in a class I was teaching a while back pointed out this article that he recalled as I was describing these systems from several years ago. What you're seeing here is actually the board that they use to manage the merging of Delta and Northwest Airlines. So clearly you don't get much larger scale than that. And you notice it's a fairly lightweight sort of thing. It's just despite the size here, they're using some very low-tech sort of tools to track what's going on. And in fact, the specific way that this board is constructed, you'll see pretty much precisely mirrors the way that we're going to recommend that you would structure such boards for your own situations. These rows you see, these bands, are what I would call value streams. Now that's a term from lean manufacturing. many of you may be familiar with, but largely associated with Toyota and Japanese manufacturing. A lot of these principles from Lean have been borrowed and applied in the Agile space over time. And the idea of a value stream is just, what does it take to, from beginning to end, to get a meaningful delivery to our customer? Someone asks for something, we look at all the stuff that happens in between that, the time of that request and the time that we deliver upon that request. That's a value stream. So their value streams in this particular example are things like their partnerships, things like airport logistics, and so on. And all of these little stickies that you see along the way there are really various milestones that they've identified for themselves that are meaningful to see progress towards that. And clearly, you're coordinating between many different people and many different organizations or departments within organizations in an example such as this. And such a system can be very useful. So let's look at then the big picture. What kind of components are we typically dealing with here? First of all, you've got the people. And obviously, agility is all about the people. We've got to get the right people in the room. So what we're talking about, we've sometimes called this an Agile PMO or Program Management Office. I'm not really trotting the description out too much here, but it's the same sort of group of people that you would have ordinarily to manage any sort of large program. It's a combination of the stakeholders who are making requests of the program and are looking at what's happening during it. There's what we might call a portfolio coordination team. This is really some of the senior people in the Agile environment, like a chief product owner or a strategic product owner, as they're sometimes called, a chief scrum master, or perhaps just a project manager. The people who tend to manage the upper level of the teams, if you will. And then there's, of course, the Agile teams themselves, and specifically representatives that they basically provide at various points in time to give insight into the specifics of technical dependencies. So you have all these people, and they're meeting, again, every, let's say, week or two. It's going to depend on how many dependencies you have and how much is happening, but something along those lines. And you see at the bottom here a large board. Now there are a few elements that are going through, and I'm going to step through these one by one. So let's begin. The rows in these boards represent these value streams, large dependent units of value. It says these would be things that your company finds important to track. Now, if you're talking about a specific program or a large project, which this could certainly work with, these would be much akin to what people would typically call epics, right? They're large-scale features that basically represent major functions of the system that you're trying to build or deliver. They may also be, in fact, value stream goals of your entire organization. They could be things like improve usability or improve customer retention or things of that nature. Excuse me. So those are representing the high-level things that really your executive stakeholders tend to care about, or the senior stakeholders of a given project. And what those are specifically is obviously going to depend on your environment. The columns are representing basically time. So it tends to be, by default, we tend to have each column represent a sprint if you're doing something like Scrum. As the board proceeds further to the right, what we tend to do is actually have those columns represent perhaps a few sprints. So you might represent, let's say, 5 or 6 sprints individually in columns, and then as you reach the 7th column, you might say, okay, that's sprints 7 through 10, and the next one is 11 through 13, and so on. Because you're trying to provide perhaps some insight into distant potential activities. And again, if we're dealing with things like waterfall teams, there may be specific deliverables that are already planned out for time periods such as that. But we don't want to try to give the impression that we have a lot of specificity available to us there. So we have kind of increasingly vague time frames, increasingly broad and not very granular ones as we proceed to the right of this board. So then if you look at the top of the board, you'll often have some sort of cards that may denote major release points. So if you have, for instance, after 4 sprints, a release at the top of that 4th column or at the interstitial point between it and the 5th column, you might have a card that said, release 1, this is your claims processing module or something of that nature. So you can just have those up there to sort of represent major milestones, if you will. The cards that are actually on the board are of a few different varieties. At a very high level, think of these as integration points, okay, or major delivery points. And we tend to sort of lump them into a few different categories. We've got their so-called feature finalizers, non-code milestones, and incremental deliveries. And you'll see a few other things there. There's an example of a card which we have there, and you notice it has a couple of stickers in the bottom left and bottom right respectively. These are representing the team that would be dealing with that particular card. You see the AB there, that would be an acronym for the team. And you see perhaps some sort of a tagging system to denote specific types of dependencies. And obviously that one there would have a legend somewhere that described what type of dependency it was in particular. So let's look at some details here, some examples of what these might be. Let's say you had a feature stream. This would be a row that said targeted marketing for customer retention. So this is, again, this is a long-term, ongoing, big goal that we have in the organization. So we may have that row there indefinitely and lots of different features and functions flowing through it. So we might have a number of cards in that row, like, for instance, usability testing session for the mobile team there. What is that? Well, that's basically it's an incremental delivery. It's something that you've got there that's it's significant, right? It's actually, I apologize. I've got this backwards. That's a non-code milestone. So we've got an example there where this is something that's important. It's important to know, right? But it's not something that we can actually go out there and deliver yet. It's something this may be a trade show. It may be a conference. It could be something that a waterfall team has for delivery, right? But that the Scrum teams are consuming. It could be anything of that nature. So it's not the same thing as a user story. It's something else that's important that you want to keep an eye on. And they tend to be very largely used to track and create really visible integration points for non-Agile teams. And also to track things that Agile teams themselves may not be doing, but that are important for them to highlight because other teams are helping them with it. Marketing documentation, operations manuals, things of that nature. The incremental deliveries are basically, they're partial deliveries against a major feature set, but they're important, again, integration points or important things you want to highlight as you go forward there. So if we have this renewal by product category report, that might be essentially a large level feature. And initially, we may be delivering a stubbed out data service for that. So that would be an example of something that we want to know we've gotten it. It's not really good enough yet that we can release it to the public, but nonetheless, it is an important delivery along the way. And it provides us a way to make sure that teams are, well, essentially making visible commitments and sticking to them, right? Which is especially important when you're talking about new Agile teams that are trying to gain the trust of their stakeholders, or, of course, waterfall teams who typically can obscure, if even unintentionally, their progress as they move along. We all know the hazards of the percentage done sort of situation. And last but not least, we've got these feature finalizers. So what are these? These are really basically the very last, if you will, let's say we're talking about user stories, it would be the last user story involved in a particular feature. So there are not going to be a whole lot of these on a typical board. They're going to represent really the ability to release a function out to production, to the public, because you've got all the little bits and pieces that are important with it. You've got them all assembled at that point. So those tend to be especially important things to highlight because it tends to be after a few of those, that's when most organizations will choose to do a release out to production. So those are the types of cards that you might see and some examples of them there. Some of the other things that are there are really to facilitate the conversations and help people at a glance to identify patterns on the board. So you've got, of course, various sorts of dependencies. These could be, usually they're dependencies on another team that is actually involved in the same portfolio or program. So you would have, again, some sort of a tagging system and legend to denote what exactly the dependencies are. And then likewise, you would have some way to identify which team is dealing with that card. You may have a number of different teams. So yet again, you're going to have a simple legend here and probably some acronyms and the like to identify each team clearly. You may also use different colors for those stickers so you can really see rapidly what the workload is for a given team or where most of their work is bulking up. You may also choose to actually highlight the card colors themselves to align with basically those different sorts of value cards that I just finished describing, the incremental deliveries, non-code milestones, and feature finalizers. Those colors can clearly be whatever you like, and you can identify other types of things. That's just what we found useful in the projects that we've used this in. And finally, you can identify blockers, of course. It tends to be that you'll have let's say you're using sticky notes to create the cards on the board. You may have a smaller red sticky note or something you stick on a card in the bottom corner to identify a blocker. And clearly, those would be the sorts of things that you would highlight and discuss when people get together and meet around this board. So all of these are by way of example, but your mileage may vary, and you want to, of course, fit this to your context. In the environments where we've built systems such as this, they've always evolved. You start out with one thing, and you see how it works, and as a core aspect of agility, you inspect and adapt, right? You're going to change the system to adapt to whatever sorts of gaps or problems that you see with it. So, as our final section here, I want to talk a little bit about actually facilitating these sessions themselves and some ways to do that more effectively. So at a very high level, what you're seeing here is a grid that's an example of the big picture of stepping above your typical sprint planning sessions and looking beyond that. We sort of look at the very highest level here first, the vision of a company. This board can actually be used to see progress towards a vision. Roadmaps, of course, exist typically to deliver against a corporate vision. And so what they tend to consist of are a number of different tangible things that you're going to be building that help to further us along some perhaps less tangible goals of the company. We want to increase customer retention. That could be part of your vision. Well, you may have a number of feature groups on your roadmap that are meant to accomplish that goal. So that's often the sort of thing you're going to see at that level. You may also have integrated release plans where you have multiple teams working against a specific release. And these are examples of the types of people who would be involved in these sessions and how often they might tend to happen. All of these things can be to some degree visualized and managed using this system that I'm describing in this thing, and we have done this in practice. So you see down there, just I'll briefly note, the people involved at these various levels. Many of you may be familiar with this this notation, this RACI notation as it's called. People who are responsible are basically the people that are doing a job, if you will. Accountable means it's someone that, if you will, that you report to, who's someone responsible would report to someone who's accountable. You have people who are consultant. You have people who are just basically get FYIs about what's been going on, get memos, and they're informed of the results. This is how you would usually see it shake out in terms of who's involved at what stages. Interestingly enough, this board can be used to tie a lot of this together well. So if you look at the specifics then, what we're usually talking about is someone like a chief scrum master. So this, it may be a chief scrum master, it may be in some cases what you might call a program manager, someone similar to that. And this person's job in this context is largely to manage the system, to manage the meetings when people get together, to make sure that the visual management system itself is suitable to the needs of the program and that it's being updated and adapted as things change, and to actually facilitate the sessions. You often usually have team scrum masters or perhaps project managers if you have waterfall projects who are involved here, and they're meant to come to these sessions with some idea of what's been going on in their respective teams, to say, here are some dependencies that our team has on yours. Here are some, an opportunity for our teams to join forces and work against a specific feature, and that sort of thing. You may also have representatives that are elected from the respective teams to talk about the details of specific technical issues that may arise or other sorts of problems. If the Scrum Master doesn't know the details of it, the team can say, here, take Johnny and he'll come to the meeting and he'll help to elucidate the specifics of that dependency there. Likewise, you may have people elected from the stakeholder realm. So let's say you're working with a specific department, a claims processing department, to continue my insurance company analogy here. They may very well want to send in some of their processors to see how things are going, or they may send in a departmental manager in some cases to try to get a sense of how things are coming together so they know when they're going to be able to switch off an older system. So this is both an information gathering session and it's an information delivery session as well. So we're telling people what's happening and when they can expect things, and we're expecting them to make decisions based upon this data that we're giving them. So given that fact, you of course also have product owners from the respective teams involved. And what they're doing is hearing about situations that may impact their respective backlogs and adapting as necessary to deal with those situations. So that might involve one product owner taking a specific set of stories from another. They may be adjusting expectations of stakeholders and so on. And finally, you may have a strategic product owner who basically has oversight over an entire product line. If you, for instance, had 5 or 6 teams working in concert against a specific product, you would have typically one strategic product owner over all 5 or 6 of those teams and product owners for each of the teams as well. So this higher level product owner would really be making a lot of the big picture decisions, like we need to move the release date, or we need to stop promising people this particular feature group will be delivered because it's not likely, things of that nature. So they're making these big picture trade-offs and making sure that they have a coherent strategy going forward. So if you look then at the way these meetings typically go, we have everybody get together every couple of weeks. What do we do first? Well, we talk about the things that we had decided to do in the last meeting. So if we had said we're going to go and move a thing from one group to another, then we may talk about exactly what happened there. If we had a blocker that we needed to deal with, we might discuss whether it's been resolved or not, and so on. You're going to update the visual management system. What does this mean? This is really very simple. What we're looking at is each team has updates that have happened since the last time they met. And again, if we have this aligned with the sprint cadence, it's very simply what's happened in the last sprint. They're updating the board to make sure that any impacts to these roll-up cards that you're seeing on the board are represented. So they might note that a card has been completed. They might push it forward from one sprint to the next. This could even be changing projections of when a card might be delivered. So in something like Scrum, you're really only explicitly planning one sprint at a time, but you're often prospectively planning future sprints, saying, here are a few things we think might happen in the future. So you may see something that you thought would be delivered a couple of sprints from now, and now you clearly know that it won't, and that sort of an update might occur as well. You might look at, of course, some status and roadblocks across the feature sets. So in this prior item, when we're updating the system, that tends to be everybody from each team just going up and moving the cards around on the board. It's not it doesn't tend to involve a whole lot of discussion. People are lightly paying attention to what everyone else is doing, but mostly they're just making sure that things are up to date. This next bit, everybody's talking about. So we're going and discussing some of the blockers we might have noted. After the teams have moved things, they're often discussing significant events of when they move things that they need to highlight to the rest of the group. Things that would foment further conversation. And finally, we might take a look at any sorts of new things that have been identified going forward. And lastly, discuss action items that we might need to take for next time. So some of the key things to remember here are that this is a roll-up. Okay, the idea here is to really have on the board not every user story and every team that you have here. These are roll-ups of features and epics, if you will, and things that are not typically managed in a product backlog, like these non-code milestones and so on. So what we really want to focus on here is getting away from the percentage done thing and moving more towards some point that we can say, there, something significant happened and it is completed. So again, this is one of the tricks to really making it work, is determining what those concrete deliverables are and how to describe them. And it tends to be one of the things that you adapt most as you go forward through as you use the system over time and adapt it. You tend to, again, typical Agile trick here, but you tend to time box the session itself. It tends to be that the initial part of it, where people are going and updating the board and talking about what's going on, is really quite brief. In our experience, it can be anywhere from maybe as little as 10 minutes up to perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, usually not much more than that, because a lot of the specifics of what happens on the board and what things need to change, it happens in little huddle sessions. Again, very similar to what you see in a daily stand-up. You identify that this team needs to go talk to these other two teams, and their respective representatives get together after the rest of the group has finished their core activities. and they talk about what they need to talk about, often little huddles, and finalize things there. So that keeps everyone else from having to sit around in a 2 or 3 hour session as you might otherwise have. And of course, there's the idea that we need to make sure the right people are there. If you have just people from the Agile teams coming here and you don't have any stakeholders involved, this system's not going to work terribly well, because you really need the stakeholders to be there to hear directly what's happening and be able to quickly offer feedback. And you're really trying to avoid other reporting sessions with this. This would be the time when they hear what's going on, so that you don't need to have another report out. This meeting can actually take the place of many other meetings that you'll typically see in organizations. Your PMO sorts of sessions and things of that nature. A lot of the same sorts of information is discussed here. So we may find it a suitable replacement for that sort of a session. Just make sure that the right people are there. You also notice, of course, I'm sure many of you are wondering, how does this work with remote and geographically distributed teams? Because you keep showing physical boards. Well, yes, there's a reason for this. There are several reasons, in fact. And they're the same ones that a lot of Agile teams today use, both physical boards and digital tools. One of them is that when we're actually doing active planning, and there's a lot of parallel activity occurring, and there are a lot of people involved, and there's a lot of data up there, it's just easier in many cases to deal with a physical board such as this, because there's not such an implication that it's finalized, that it's the plan and it's concrete and there aren't changes. We want to actually present the notion here that there will be change. It may be a little change, it may be a lot, but we want the system to change as easily as possible. A lot of the same philosophy here behind things like Agile engineering methods. They're there to make change simpler and cheaper, so that when we need to adapt and be flexible, it's not such a big deal. It's also the fact that the physical boards tend to be a little bit more accountable, if you will, than the tools. With tools, you tend to have only 1 or 2 people really actively engaging with them and updating them, at certain levels at least. And as such, it can be a little difficult to have that aspect of transparency where everybody sees what's going on, and when decisions are made, they're made with everybody else who is going to be impacted by that decision present and engage in the discussion. So they're good information radiators, and they're good ways to facilitate these group conversations and activities. There's also the fact that when you move something on a board, everybody sees it right then and there, and it makes it harder for people to hide when progress is actually not being made. Again, that's a lot of the idea behind this system, is to take things that are otherwise fuzzy and easy to make fuzzy and try to force them into some aspect of tangibility. And lastly, it just tends to be that actually dealing with the information that emerges from these sessions is easier when you've got the people around, for all of the same reasons that it would be easier for any other sort of decision-making session. We want people to just be able to hear what's going on, make snap decisions on 1 or 2 items, and that would be it. They're meeting frequently enough here. There don't tend to be really dramatic major updates every time. They tend to be relatively a few small incremental updates each time. So these aren't long sessions, and you can essentially make the decisions and just move on with things rather than have them defer to some other meeting off in the future at some point. And lastly, and this will finalize our core portion of the presentation, you of course have digital tools that can do a lot of this as well. And what you're going to often see is that it tends to be people use both. They'll use a board such as the ones I've been displaying for the actual facilitation of meetings. And if you have, and this only scales to a certain point, but let's say you have 2 major locations. We have some clients that have replicated the board at both locations, and then you have some sort of a situation where you have card buddies or the like, someone who actually links with people at another location and updates things when they update them, when their partner updates them, and other such strategies to make sure that things stay in sync. It tends to also be that when you're using digital tools, you'll run the meeting with a physical thing, and then you'll have a digital representation of the board as well that usually someone like the Chief Scrum Master would go and quickly update after the meeting. And again, while there's no getting away from the fact that this is a double entry situation, it tends to be not such a big deal as you might imagine, because the updates are really not that myriad as time goes on. So it tends to not take very long for a single person to go and make sure that the digital tool is a good mirror of the physical one. So what I might recommend is, if you're looking at representing this in a digital environment, and of course this is useful for ongoing analytics and reporting anyway, you might look at some things like VersionOne's road mapping feature. It tends to be about the same level of detail that you're seeing on these boards. And for the facilitation aspect, you can of course use tools like the one we're using now in concert with video conferencing methods and the like to try to just get as close as you can to that we're there sort of feel for the session. That'll make it a little bit easier to facilitate. In those cases, you've got to be especially cognizant of keeping things flowing and making sure that people are engaging at the right points in time. But it can and has been done. Again, though, I would heartily recommend that you give the physical board a try if it's at all viable in your particular environment. And with that, we can wrap it up here, and wanted to go ahead and throw it out there for some potential questions that we have.
All right, we already have a few questions coming in, and please, everyone, continue to ask your questions through the question feature. First question, can you clarify incremental delivery? Is it being delivered to production or a staging environment?
So it tends to be that would be more the sort of thing you'd have delivered to a staging environment, but it's not so much an environment's issue as it is, are we ready to actually release this to the world? So when we say production, that's of course what that typically implies. In some situations, you may have so-called continuous delivery environments where things are actually being released to production, but turned off until such a time as it's appropriate to release them. But usually what we're talking about here are things that are leading up to a production release. There are significant milestones, but it just isn't quite there for the real world yet.
All right. Next question. Would you want to track dependencies in the form of dependency to and dependency from?
You might very well, in fact. What it will tend to do is have, what we've often done is have dependencies simply link from one team to another. So it tends to be that the dependency tags would actually, if it showed up on my team's cards and my dependency was on another team, that's what the dependency card would denote. It would denote the other team. So you effectively have that linkage occurring there. But you could very well come up with a separate tagging system if that made it easier to see the nature of the dependencies in your environment. We would often do it in such a way that at a glance you can really look across the board and see where a lot of the dependencies are occurring between particular teams.
All right. And I just want to remind everyone, I'm getting a couple questions in about this. We will be emailing all participants a copy of the webinar, so we would love for you to share it with your team. Next question. Is the visual management planning session the same as the integrated release planning?
I'm sorry, what was the first part of that?
Is the visual management planning session the same as the integrated release planning?
Fundamentally it is. Yeah, I mean this is really talking about getting together and having a session that addresses releases across multiple teams. It's kind of, we're sort of towing the line here between your typical outcomes at sprint planning. So each team is rolling up what they've done in a given sprint into just a couple of items that might be important. And we're looking at how that actually impacts the releases. So essentially, yes. But I say essentially because it also does, in fact, address aspects of that roadmap and vision levels that we were talking about there. Those emerge from the board because you see, in fact, the vision deals with those value streams at the big picture level, and the roadmap deals with progress along those value streams. So the release planning is focusing on, if you will, maybe a third of the board, for instance, at any given point in time, whereas the roadmap and the vision aspects are the big picture of the entire board. So it kind of stretches across all of those areas.
All right. Next question. What is the difference between project portfolio management and program management?
So it tends to be that portfolio management is talking about really everything you're doing in your company. That's what portfolio tends to be, whereas a program tends to be a number of different teams or a number of different projects that are all under some common cohesive umbrella or goal. So a program is usually just a really big project is what it amounts to, or a series, again, of related projects, whereas a portfolio tends to be not necessarily related stuff at all. It's just everything you're doing.
All right. Next question. You're just powering through these. It's awesome. We might be able to get to all of them. Let's see. How do you deal with sprint teams with different sprint schedule dates?
Well, you're trying to essentially find so-called harmonic cadences here, right? You're trying to find overlapping points between those teams where it's convenient for them to meet. And at a higher level here, the cadences in general here, you want them to be such that there's progress being made and significant progress between each, but they're not so infrequent that major risky events can occur in between meetings. You want things to so it tends to be usually every 2 weeks or so is roughly right here. But what I mean by the harmonic cadences might be, let's say you have a team with a 2-week sprint and a team with a 4-week sprint. The overlap point there would be perhaps at the 4 weeks, but since that might be too long, what we're saying is we might in fact meet every 2 weeks instead, and we would just have probably an expectation that the updates from the 4-week team wouldn't be quite as significant in the middle of that. But in general, you're looking for something where there's some overlap points, integration points between the teams that make some sense and allow us to represent what's going on at the proper level of detail and before things can get out of hand, frequently enough that we can make decisions and avoid major disasters occurring.
All right, next question. What would be the responsibilities of the chief of Scrum Masters?
So Scrum Masters tend to be, of course, at the team level, right, at the individual team level, and a chief Scrum Master tends to essentially pull together the threads across teams. So they're not dealing with any particular team's product backlog or the like. They're dealing with coordination between the teams. They're much like a program manager might be in that respect. They're also dealing with cross-cutting issues typically that affect all of the teams, and this could be everything from tooling platforms to training to maybe audits that are occurring in the organization that are going to affect everybody, enterprise standards, things of that nature. So they're really trying to take all of the individual Scrum Masters and pull together these threads and make sure that when there is coordination between the teams and collaboration, that it goes smoothly. I would also say in the big picture, in respect to this presentation, they're the ones responsible for this entire visual management system, as it tends to be. They're there making sure that they design the board or help to design it in many cases. They make sure that they pay attention to what's working and what's not, and they make sure it gets updated and suits everybody's needs over time.
All right. Next question. In your opinion, what's the maximum number of people who should be in the planning session based on your experience?
Well, we've had shockingly large numbers of people in these sessions at some points in time, up to 50, 60, 70 people at some times, but they're not all actually doing anything all the time. I would say typically you're not usually looking at much more than probably a dozen, in practice, but it's going to depend just how big the effort is. You want to make sure you've got representation from all of the various teams who are involved, and you're going to have some of these high-level, the chief Scrum Master, chief product owner, a couple of people at that level, and then you're going to have some of the stakeholders who are involved. And that'll tend to be a rotating crew, right? So a stakeholder who has something interesting happen in their environment now may not have anything happening that they need to attend for a couple of months from now. So that group of stakeholders is going to be a very dynamic group that's going to match the situation. But typically, I guess, a dozen to 20 people or something of that nature is what you might often see, with only a handful of them actually interacting at any particular point in time. You might imagine a chief Scrum Master facilitating this session and sort of running their fingers down the board and saying, and just looking for people to offer up updates. Say, oh yes, I've got an update to that card there. The chief Scrum Master moves it on their behalf. The more people you have, the more you have to have a single point of facilitation for some things like this to make sure that things keep moving along. So that's what the chief Scrum Master is doing.
Do you ever get pushback of people wanting to do their own planning separately because they're concerned with too many people? And how do you handle that situation if it does come up?
Well, there's nothing wrong with the respective groups doing their own planning. This session is really meant to highlight the points that matter to everybody else, right? So it may very well be that a given group needs to go off and and talk about what they're going to be doing in this session. In fact, let's say you've got a specific team, you might augment their daily scrum to add in a question about specifically dependencies. In addition to what we did yesterday and what we're going to do today and what risks we have individually speaking, we might kind of introduce a little bit of the scrum of scrums in there and say, and is there anything right now at the moment that we need from another team or that we're doing that some other team needs to be aware of? And really the Scrum Master is taking those things and setting them aside for illumination in this visual management session here. So that's in a portfolio coordination session, that is. So they're taking those things, and then when you come to this meeting, they're really just offering up the things that are going to have an impact or are interesting in some respect to the other people at this meeting. So no problem with separate sessions to prepare for it. But I think that the whole point of this is transparency at the levels that matter. So you need to watch out for the situations where people are obscuring things because they don't want to show that they're not making progress. The whole point of this is to force things out of the open.
All right. Thank you. Next question. What are your thoughts regarding how to make this physical board work with remote teams?
So some of the tips basically, you can always have the remote teams viewing it. You might use something like a webcam or the like, but you run into resolution issues, frankly. That's when you have a large board like this, part of the reason you often go with physical tools is because there's a lot of information being represented on that board, and it's just very difficult to fit onto your typical screen resolutions that you'll see. So either you can replicate the board at multiple locations, which is one option, and again, then you have kind of linking pin people at each location who make sure that when their respective buddy updates something that they update it on their side too, or you can use some sort of a digital tool if you like to try to eliminate the physical aspect altogether.
Okay, next question. How have you linked this Agile portfolio approach to an application lifecycle management approach and/or tool?
Well, this is, we've used it with a number of different tools. The application lifecycle management, as you say, they tend to be, some of the big tools are ones like VersionOne, things like Mingle and so on, and we've actually used pretty much all of the major ones that you've heard of at various clients. Whatever they tend to be using at the time, there tends to be some way to represent this same level of detail there. It tends to be in the, either they have something about programs or, epics and things like that, roadmaps. Those sorts of functionalities in the various tools tend to be operated at the level of detail that we're talking about for this board. So you've got to frankly find ways with whatever tool you have, or if you don't have one, by all means try VersionOne to do it, to represent this right level of detail that's going to give you an insight into what's happening at this program or portfolio level. So integrating it in, you're really looking at dealing with the roll-up here.
All right. Next question. How do you handle a situation where a lot of product owners want to improve your product, but you have a limited size of teams? What's the best solution to align these expectations so that you don't overload the team? Has a chief of product owners ever been used or suggested in your experience?
Yeah, a team of product owners is fairly commonplace, and when that happens, of course, you need to have someone over all of it to coordinate and, if you will, make sure that you have diplomatic discussions about things and that when trade-offs need to be made, they're made. If you have a bunch of people who are individually self-interested, then it can obviously be difficult to get them to come to a common consensus when they're all seen as peers and equals. So often in those cases, you'll have a chief product owner who tries to pull together those various threads and really sets up a system for bargaining between them. While it's outside the scope of this presentation, we've employed things like virtual economies and the like, and you may have seen things like buy a feature and so on, and games, innovation games, things of that nature. These are all meant to, in fact, facilitate conversations and balance and make trade-offs when you have situations like that. We're all in this situation where we have demand exceeding capacity. So all we can really do there is make what our true capacity is more visible, which boards like this can help to do. It'll show you where things are moving and where they're not, and then decide the best way to actually allocate our demand against the capacity that we have.
All right. Next question, I think this will be our last. We're about out of time. What's the best way to mix waterfall, the percentage of waterfall completion, with Agile burn down data to show the progress of the portfolio?
That is really what those incremental delivery cards are all about. What you're really trying to do are just find ways to make more concrete those percentage complete sort of things. So if you have, for instance, a design documentation, you might subset it. You might say, look, the waterfall team is building design documentation for this whole system in a big phase, perhaps, but we really just want to see the design for this particular, enterprise service bus or whatever, this particular aspect of the project that matters to us right now. So we're going to define a card for an incremental delivery that represents essentially a partially complete design document, but one that is complete in this one particular area. So that allows, that creates a, if you will, a somewhat artificial inflection point, but one that's meaningful to other teams, where the waterfall team is essentially is forced into somewhat incremental releases of the things that they're doing. And believe it or not, this really does help to, over time, move these waterfall teams into more of an agile mode of operation. And that's of course, a really nice side benefit.
All right. We're out of time. I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending the webinar, and of course, thank you to Arlen for presenting and getting through a great number of questions. I think it started a really great discussion. We will be emailing everyone a copy of the recording of the presentation. We want you to share it with your teams, and we also include information to contact Arlen and Lightspeed for their training and consulting services. So thanks again to everyone, and have a great day.
All right. Thank you all, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Arlen.